So we've talked about misconceptions, we've talked about impacts, and we've talked about law and policy surrounding cannabis. And all these things impact us and our decision on whether and how to use cannabis. Now, when it comes to harm, obviously our inclination is to avoid it as much as we can, and that's natural. So let's talk about some ways to reduce the severity of harm when it comes to cannabis use. First, what is harm reduction? In the field of substance use, harm reduction is approaches to minimize the negative impacts substance use has both on yourself and the people around you. It isn't harm prevention. Obviously, the best way to prevent harm is to abstain from using substances in the first place. But there are ways to minimize the potential negative impacts to self and others when it comes to cannabis use. It's important to keep in mind, though, that engaging in any kind of substance use is going to come with some level of risk, from personal injury while intoxicated to legal consequences depending on the substance and the circumstance. The goal here is to alleviate stigma, make it easier to talk about, and do what we can to stay safe to the best of our ability. So, a study was done in 2022 that compiled best practices and evidence based findings from the field of research around weed use. And in that study, they found 12 key ways to reduce harm when it came to cannabis use risk. First, the later you start using, the better. Using cannabis as a teenager or young adult means using a psychoactive drug while your brain is still developing and making crucial connections, which could disrupt brain development. It's also crucial, like we touched on earlier, to know the dose of THC in cannabis products you're consuming. And next, we want to protect our heart and lungs. The smoke inhalation from cannabis, or really smoking any substance, has negative impacts on both our heart and our breathing. So, seek alternative methods where possible if you're going to use cannabis. If you do smoke, however, avoid holding the smoke in your lungs to minimize potential exposure to toxins. And this next one is simple enough: moderation, moderation, moderation. How much and how often you use cannabis is going to be linked to the presence and severity of negative impacts. So, sticking in that range of recreational use, less than once a week, is the safest way to go about using when it comes to use level. Next, know where the product is from. Products from dispensaries come with labels on things like THC and CBD content and are far less likely to be laced with other substances you didn't sign on for. We talked earlier about how cannabis can negatively impact the brain as well. Keep those things in mind and watch out for the warning signs. If you begin to notice a decline in memory recall or cognitive functioning, consider taking an extended break or stopping altogether. This next one is crucial too. Do not drive. Driving under the influence is highly illegal, but also extremely dangerous to both yourself and the other people around you. So, wait at least 6 to 8 hours after having smoked cannabis to drive, or 8 to 12 hours if you've consumed edibles. Consider abstaining or minimizing use if you're planning on conceiving a child because of the impacts that cannabis has on reproductive functioning. And avoid mixing cannabis with other drugs and substances like alcohol, as the mixture of substances can exacerbate the impacts of both. Next, know your health history. We talked about potential impacts on mental health disorders and physical health outcomes, much of which can run in the family. If you've got a diagnosis that's made worse by cannabis use, or something like schizophrenia runs in your family, consider that before deciding whether or not cannabis is the best choice for you. And lastly, know your overall risk level. Whether you're low, moderate, or high risk has drastic implications on these negative impacts. Know where you fall on that spectrum, what that means, and set goals or reach out for help if you're not content with the risk level that you fall into. And a final note on harm reduction. Anytime you use cannabis, you're taking on some extent of risk for negative health outcomes. The keys are to reduce the extent of the negative impacts, but the only way to avoid them altogether is through abstinence. Also know that cannabis use disorder does exist, and frequent use over a long period of time can lead to CUD. If you or someone you know is experiencing cannabis use disorder, consider getting help. Visit NAU Counseling Services for more information. And lastly, practice social responsibility. Reducing harm is not only for your own well being, but other people around you. Remember to stay aware of how your actions impact others and avoid things like exposing others to smoke or driving while impaired.